In September 1991, two hikers in the Fitztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy spotted something dark protruding from melting glacier ice. It turned out to be a body, remarkably, almost impossibly well preserved, frozen and naturally mummified for over 5,000 years. Researchers named him Ötzi, and once his clothing was carefully removed, scientists found something nobody expected to see so clearly preserved from that far back in human history: tattoos. 61 of them, dark lines and small crosses etched into his skin, still visible after 5 millennia frozen in ice. Ötzi wasn't the first tattooed human being who ever lived. He is simply the oldest one whose actual skin survived long enough for us to see the proof directly, which raises the real question at the heart of this video. If Ötzi already had dozens of tattoos over 5,000 years ago, applied with clear skill and apparent purpose, how much further back does this practice actually go? The honest answer involves both a surprisingly solid piece of frozen evidence and a much larger, murkier mystery hiding just behind it. Let's start with what Ötzi's tattoos actually tell us, because they're more informative than simple decoration would be. Researchers examining Ötzi's markings found something distinctly non-random about their placement. They cluster heavily around his joints, particularly his lower spine, knees, and ankles, areas that, through separate analysis of his skeleton, show clear signs of degenerative wear and likely arthritis. This pattern led many researchers to propose a genuinely striking hypothesis. Ötzi's tattoos may not have been primarily decorative at all. They may have functioned as a form of ancient therapeutic treatment, applied specifically at points of chronic pain in a practice that bears a notable resemblance to the point locations used in acupuncture, a medical tradition formally documented thousands of years later in China. Whether this represents genuine convergent medical knowledge, entirely independent of later Chinese acupuncture tradition, or simply a coincidental overlap in the logical places humans might choose to mark a body in pain, remains a subject of real scientific debate. What is not in debate is the method. Analysis of Ötzi's tattoos shows they were created by making small incisions in the skin, then rubbing in fine charcoal or soot, a technique distinct from, but conceptually related to, the needle puncture methods used in many later tattooing traditions. For over 2 decades after Ötzi's discovery, he held the title of the oldest confirmed tattooed human remains ever found. Then, in 2018, that title quietly changed. Researchers re-examining 2 ancient Egyptian mummies held in the British Museum, using infrared imaging technology capable of revealing tattoos invisible to the naked eye on darkened, desiccated skin, made a striking discovery. One mummy, referred to as Siberian man, previously assumed to be tattoo-free based on visual inspection alone, was found to carry tattooed images of a wild bull and a Barbary sheep on his upper arm. Radiocarbon dating placed Siberian man at somewhere between 3,351 and 3017 BCE, a range that overlaps with, and by some estimates may even slightly predate, Ötzi himself, whose own dating places him at roughly 3,350 to 3,105 BCE. A second mummy examined in the same study, a woman now sometimes called the Siberian woman, was found to carry tattoos as well, including motifs resembling batons or clappers, objects associated in ancient Egyptian art with ritual and dance. This finding mattered for more than just claiming a new oldest tattoo record. It demonstrated that tattooing wasn't a single isolated invention discovered once and then spread outward. It showed up independently, at roughly the same moment in deep history, in 2 completely separate regions, Alpine Europe and North Africa, with no clear evidence either culture had any direct contact with or influence from the other. 2 unconnected ancient cultures, continents apart, both independently deciding that permanently marking human skin was worth doing, using broadly similar underlying methods at almost exactly the same point in history. The imaging method that revealed the Siberian mummy's tattoos is worth pausing on briefly too, because it hints at how much more evidence may still be sitting undiscovered in museum collections around the world. Infrared imaging works by capturing wavelengths of light beyond what the human eye can perceive. wavelengths that can penetrate slightly deeper into darkened, desiccated tissue and reveal contrast between plain skin and the carbon-based pigments used in ancient tattooing, differences completely invisible under ordinary lighting and direct visual inspection. Since this technique only became practical to apply broadly and non-destructively to fragile mummified remains relatively recently, researchers strongly suspect that other tattooed mummies examined decades ago under older, less capable methods and confidently cataloged as tattoo-free may simply have never been looked at correctly in the first place. The Siberian mummies had been sitting in the British Museum's collection since the early 1900s. Their tattoos went completely unnoticed for well over a century. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because nobody had yet developed the right way of actually looking for it. That overlap raises an uncomfortable, genuinely important question for anyone trying to pin down a true origin date. Are Ötzi and the Siberian mummies really close to when tattooing began? Or are they simply the oldest examples we happen to have found, purely because of an accident of preservation? This is where the science of taphonomy, the study of how organic remains decay or survive over time, becomes critical to understanding the actual limits of what we can know here. Human skin is an extraordinarily fragile material in archaeological terms. Under normal burial conditions, soft tissue decomposes completely within a matter of years to decades, long before it has any chance of surviving into the deep archaeological record at all. Tattooed skin only survives long enough to be discovered under very specific, unusual preservation conditions. Frozen in glacial ice, as with Ötzi, desiccated in extremely arid desert conditions, as with Egyptian mummies, or preserved in specific waterlogged, low-oxygen environments like certain peat bogs, which means our entire physical evidence for the history of tattooing is filtered through an extremely narrow, geographically limited set of lucky accidents. Any ancient tattooing practiced in more typical burial conditions, most of the ancient world essentially, would have left no directly visible physical trace at all, the skin itself long since gone, regardless of whether tattoos were once there. Given that limitation, most archaeologists studying this topic treat Ötzi and the Siberian mummies not as the actual beginning of tattooing, but simply as the oldest point our physical evidence happens to reach. With the true origin almost certainly sitting somewhere further back in time, hidden behind a wall of decomposed skin, will likely never directly recover. So if the skin itself is gone, is there any other way to push this timeline back further? There is, through indirect evidence, the tools themselves. Archaeologists have identified bone and ivory artifacts from Upper Paleolithic sites, some tens of thousands of years old, that some researchers argue show physical characteristics consistent with tattooing implements, sharpened points, in some cases combined with residue analysis suggesting contact with pigment. This evidence is considerably more contested and interpretively difficult than something as direct as Ötzi's preserved, visible tattoos. A sharpened bone point could plausibly have served many different purposes: sewing, engraving, ritual use, and confidently identifying a specific artifact as a tattoo tool purely from its shape. And any trace residue is a genuinely difficult claim to prove with full scientific confidence. What is considerably less controversial is that ochre, a natural iron oxide pigment ranging from yellow to deep red, was being deliberately processed and used by humans for a wide variety of purposes, including body decoration of some kind, for well over 100,000 years, based on ochre processing sites and ochre residue found on human remains across multiple continents. This doesn't prove tattooing specifically. Ochre could just as easily have been used for painting skin temporarily, decorating tools, or ritual burial practices entirely separate from permanent tattooing. But it does establish something important. Humans were clearly invested in intentionally marking and modifying the human body using pigment, in some form, for an extraordinarily long span of time, long before Ötzi or the Siberian mummies existed at all, which makes the idea that permanent tattooing specifically might stretch back considerably further than our currently available direct physical evidence entirely plausible, even if it currently remains unprovable in the strictest scientific sense. Moving forward in time to an era where the physical evidence becomes considerably richer, we arrive at one of the most visually spectacular tattoo discoveries in the entire archaeological record, the Pazyryk culture of ancient Siberia. The Pazyryk were a nomadic Iron Age people living roughly 2,500 years ago in the Altai Mountains, and several of their elite burials, preserved by an unusual combination of construction and permafrost that essentially froze the tombs solid shortly after burial, have yielded remarkably intact mummified remains. The tattoos found on Pazyryk mummies are extraordinarily elaborate compared to Ötzi's relatively simple lines and dots, intricate, stylized depictions of deer, mountain goats, griffins, and other animals, rendered with genuine artistic sophistication, covering large areas of the arms, torso, and legs of both male and high-status female individuals. One especially famous example, sometimes called the Siberian Ice Maiden, a young woman buried with considerable ceremony and status markers, was found with detailed animal tattoos on her arms and shoulder, evidence that elaborate tattooing in this culture wasn't limited exclusively to warriors or men. Researchers studying Pazyryk burial customs generally interpret these elaborate tattoos as markers of social status and identity, though the exact specific meaning of individual animal motifs and whether particular designs indicated clan membership, personal achievements, or spiritual protection remains an active area of scholarly interpretation and debate. What is clear is that by this point in history, roughly 2,500 years ago, tattooing had already developed into a highly refined artistic and technical skill, executed with a level of precision and detail that took real specialized expertise to produce. The word tattoo itself has a considerably more recent origin story than the practice it describes, and it comes from an entirely different part of the world, Polynesia. The English word derives from tatau, a term from Polynesian languages brought back to Europe following the Pacific voyages of Captain James Cook in the late 1700s. Cook's expeditions and the detailed written accounts of crew members like the naturalist Joseph Banks documented extensive, sophisticated tattooing traditions across numerous Pacific Island cultures, practices that had clearly been refined and culturally embedded for many generations prior to European contact, entirely independent of any European or Asian tattooing tradition. In many Polynesian cultures, tattooing, known by various related terms across different island groups, carried deep genealogical and social significance, with specific patterns denoting lineage, rank, achievements, and spiritual protection, applied using traditional tools, often combs made from bone, turtle shell, or shark teeth struck with a small mallet to puncture the skin and deposit pigment. This tradition represents yet another clearly independent invention of tattooing. Entirely separate from the Alpine European tradition, Ötzi belonged to the North African tradition of the Jebelline mummies and the Siberian tradition of the Pazyryk, adding a fourth, completely unconnected geographic origin point to a practice that increasingly looks less like a single invention that spread, and more like something humans in radically different environments, separated by oceans and millennia, kept independently arriving at on their own. The list doesn't stop there either. The Ainu people, indigenous to northern Japan, developed an elaborate tattooing tradition, particularly among women, involving distinctive dark markings around the mouth. Historically documented well into more recent centuries and believed by researchers to represent a considerably older pre-existing practice. Various indigenous cultures across North America developed their own distinct tattooing traditions long before European contact, using tools like bone needles and cactus spines with natural pigments developed entirely independently of any Old World influence, with specific meanings and methods varying considerably between different nations and regions across the continent. Each addition to this list makes the same underlying point a little harder to avoid. This wasn't a single good idea that happened once and then diffused outward across trade routes and conquest. It was something separate groups of humans, isolated from each other by oceans, mountain ranges, and millennia, kept arriving at again and again independently, as though it were less an invention than a recurring discovery waiting to be made. Not every ancient culture that practiced tattooing viewed it the same way, though, And the contrast is genuinely revealing. In ancient Greece and later Rome, tattooing existed, but largely with an inverted social meaning compared to many of the cultures discussed so far. Historical sources indicate the Greeks learned tattooing practices, partly through contact with neighboring Thracian and Scythian peoples, cultures the Greeks themselves generally regarded as tattooing extensively, and from the Greek perspective in a genuinely decorative high-status manner. But within Greek and later Roman society itself, tattoos were frequently associated, not with elite status, but with punishment and subjugation, marking slaves, criminals, and in the Roman military sometimes branded onto soldiers, specifically as a deterrent against desertion, a visible, permanent way of controlling and identifying specific individuals against their will. This creates a striking contrast sitting right alongside the Paisoric and Polynesian traditions discussed earlier. In some ancient cultures, an elaborate tattoo signaled elite status, spiritual protection, and personal achievement. In others, a tattoo, often much simpler and applied without consent, signaled the exact opposite, a permanent, visible mark of low status or outright punishment. The same basic technology, permanently depositing pigment beneath the skin, was independently interpreted in almost diametrically opposed ways by different ancient cultures, sometimes within the same broad region and general era. It is worth briefly addressing the actual biology of why tattoos remain permanent at all, since it is a detail most people never think to ask about, despite it being the entire reason this whole archaeological record exists in the first place. Skin has two main layers, the epidermis, the outer layer that is constantly shedding and regenerating, and the dermis, a deeper, much more stable layer underneath it. A temporary skin marking, like ochre paint or henna, sits only in or on the epidermis, which is why it fades and disappears within days to weeks, as those outer skin cells naturally slough off and get replaced. Tattooing works specifically because it deposits pigment particles down into the dermis, the deeper, structurally stable layer that isn't subject to that same constant surface turnover. The body's immune system actually plays a direct, active role in tattoo permanence, too. Specialized immune cells called macrophages, whose normal job is identifying and clearing foreign material from the body, engulf the tattoo pigment particles. But the particles are frequently too large for the macrophages to fully break down and eliminate. The result is a kind of permanent biological standoff. Pigment particles held in place inside these immune cells, sitting suspended in the dermis, indefinitely visible through the translucent skin above for the rest of a person's life. And in ideal preservation conditions, as Ötzi and the Siberian mummies demonstrate, for thousands of years after that person has died, ancient tattoo artists across every one of these completely independent cultures had clearly worked out, empirically through trial and observation rather than any understanding of dermal biology or macrophages, exactly how deep a puncture needed to go to create a mark that would actually last a lifetime. So when did ancient humans actually start getting tattoos? The most honest, precise answer science can currently offer is this. We have direct physical proof reaching back at least 5,300 years to Ötzi in the Alps and the Siberian mummies in Egypt. Two completely independent traditions existing at almost exactly the same moment in deep history. We have indirect evidence in the form of processed pigment and possible tool artifacts, suggesting the underlying human impulse to mark and modify skin may reach back tens of thousands of years further still, though the proof needed to confirm that specific claim has almost certainly long since decomposed and disappeared. And we have a growing, genuinely remarkable pattern of independent invention: Alpine Europe, North Africa, Iron Age Siberia, and Polynesia, 4 separate cultures separated by oceans, mountain ranges, and thousands of years, each apparently arriving at the same basic idea and largely the same basic method entirely on their own. Tattooing isn't a single invention that spread outward from one clever ancient culture to the rest of the world. It looks, increasingly, like something closer to a recurring, deeply rooted human behavior, something our species seems to have independently reinvented, again and again, in wildly different times and places, for reasons ranging from medicine to status, to spirituality, to outright punishment. We may never find the actual first tattoo. The skin it was carried on almost certainly turned to dust millennia before anyone thought to go looking for it. But every time a new frozen body or a newly rescanned mummy turns out to be carrying ink nobody expected to find, the timeline quietly pushes back again, and the honest answer to this question keeps getting a little older and a little less certain at exactly the same time.